The screaming started at midnight. Royal physician Dr. Edmund Hartwell, shaken awake by the sound of panicked footsteps thundering through the marble corridors of Ashmore Palace. He stumbled out of his quarters in the medical wing, his heart already racing. In his 30 years serving the royal family of Heartland, he had never heard that particular sound, the sound of absolute terror mixed with desperate urgency. The screams continued, high-pitched and blood-curdling, echoing through the ancient walls like something from a nightmare. When Hartwell burst into the east wing, he found complete chaos. Servants were running in every direction. Palace guards stood confused outside a locked mahogany door, the bedroom of 17-year-old Princess Victoria, the beloved only daughter of King Edward and Queen Margaret. The king himself stood in his nightclothes, his face pale as death, shouting orders that no one seemed able to follow. "Break it down," the king roared, his voice cracking. "Break it down now." Princess Victoria's screams had transformed into desperate, inhuman wails. There were sounds of someone in absolute agony, someone experiencing something beyond normal pain. The guards hesitated, looking at each other uncertainly. This was the princess, the future of the kingdom. How could they simply smash down her door? "Your Majesty, perhaps, if we could find the key," Captain Harrison began, but another scream cut him off. This one was different, shorter, more like a cry of despair. "There is no key," Queen Margaret sobbed, her hands covering her face. "The key is missing. It's been missing since this afternoon." Dr. Hartwell's medical training kicked in. He examined the door, listening carefully. The screams had stopped, replaced by something worse, complete, terrifying silence. Whatever was happening inside that room was escalating beyond the screams. A body in extreme distress will eventually break down. The silence suggested something had changed. Something had gotten worse. "Your Majesty, we must enter immediately," Hartwell said. His voice steady, despite the cold fear running through his veins. The king nodded sharply. "Break it down now, all of you." 3 guards charged forward simultaneously, throwing their combined weight against the reinforced mahogany door. The wood groaned in protest but held firm. Again, they charged. The door shuddered. A third time. Finally, with a deafening crack, the ancient hinges gave way, and the door crashed inward. What they found would haunt everyone in that room for the rest of their lives, Princess. Victoria lay on her bedroom floor. Her body twisted at an impossible angle, her face contorted in a mask of pure anguish. But it wasn't her position that made the guards freeze in horror. It was what lay around her. The floor of her bedroom was covered in scratch marks, deep gouges in the polished wood and carpet. The marks led in a chaotic pattern from her bed to the far corner of the room where she now lay. Her fingernails were broken and bloody. Her hands were covered in deep cuts. And most disturbing of all, there was a trail of blood leading from her bed across the entire floor. "Victoria." Queen Margaret rushed forward, pushing past the guards, but Dr. Hartwell caught her arm gently. "Your Majesty, please. Let me examine her first." He knelt beside the princess, his hands moving quickly but carefully across her body. As he did, the horrifying truth began to emerge. The princess was completely paralyzed from the neck down. She could move nothing below her shoulders. Yet her eyes were aware, terrified, and darting frantically around the room as if searching for something. "Can you hear me, Your Highness?" Hartwell asked gently. Victoria's eyes blinked twice. "Yes." "Do you feel pain?" This time her eyes blinked rapidly, repeatedly, the universal sign for yes, yes, yes. She was in agony. She had dragged herself across the floor with only her arms, her useless legs trailing behind her. Leaving that terrible trail of blood, the king staggered backward, his face going white. The queen began to wail. "How?" King Edward's voice was barely a whisper. "How did this happen?" "She was fine this morning. She was fine at dinner." But the real question, the question that would consume the royal household and eventually shock the entire kingdom of Heartland, was one that no one dared to ask aloud. Not yet. Not while they still didn't understand what had caused a healthy 17-year-old girl to suddenly become completely paralyzed. The servants had begun to whisper about it already. About the missing key? About why it had gone missing. about who had taken it and why they would trap the princess inside her own room. And most mysteriously of all, about what exactly Victoria had been doing in those hours alone, locked in that room before the paralysis struck her down. As Dr. Hartwell worked to stabilize the princess, one thought consumed his mind. This wasn't an accident. This was something deliberate, something planned. And the missing key was only the beginning of a mystery that would eventually expose secrets that the royal family had been hiding for years. By morning, the entire palace was in lockdown. King Edward had ordered every servant questioned. Every guard was being investigated. The simple fact was this: someone had taken the key to Princess Victoria's bedroom door and deliberately prevented her from leaving. But why? And more importantly, what had caused her sudden paralysis? Dr. Hartwell had spent the entire night conducting tests on the princess. Her paralysis was complete, but localized to her lower body. Her upper body functioned normally, though she had refused to speak a single word since the guards broke down her door. The trauma of the experience had clearly affected her profoundly, but the physical cause remained a mystery. It's not a normal spinal injury, Hartwell explained to the king in the early morning hours, his voice heavy with exhaustion. If she had fallen or suffered trauma, we would see swelling, bruising. There is none. Her spine appears completely intact on examination. This is something else. King Edward sat in the palace library, his face haggard and aged by the crisis. He had ruled the kingdom of Heartland for 25 years with wisdom and grace, but he looked now like a broken man. Could it be poison? The king asked desperately. Possibly, Hartwell admitted, but poison would typically show other symptoms: vomiting, delirium, pain elsewhere in the body. This is selective paralysis affecting only her legs and lower abdomen. The guard entered, bowing deeply. Your Majesty, we have discovered something. In Princess Victoria's room, the king stood immediately, and Hartwell followed him as they rushed back to the east wing. The bedroom had been sealed off, but the guard was authorized to bring them inside. What they found made Hartwell's blood run cold. Scattered across Princess Victoria's vanity were 3 empty glass bottles. They were small, delicate bottles, the kind used for expensive perfumes or medicines. Hartwell picked one up carefully, sniffing it. The smell was almost completely gone, but there was something lingering, something chemical and vaguely familiar. He had smelled something like this before in his medical training. Test these, he said to the guard. Immediately. I need to know exactly what was in these bottles. But even as he said it, a terrible suspicion was forming in his mind. A suspicion so dark, so deeply troubling, that he could barely bring himself to voice it. Your Majesty, Hartwell said carefully, I must ask you something, and it is a question that will seem inappropriate, but I must ask it. Was the princess involved in any kind of experimentation? Self-medication? Anything at all that might suggest she was consuming unknown substances? King Edward's face went pale. Absolutely not. My daughter would never, Your Majesty. Someone locked her in that room. Someone took that key deliberately. Either someone is harming your daughter, or he let the implication hang in the air. The king understood. Either someone was attacking the princess, or the princess had engineered this situation herself for reasons they didn't yet understand. The investigation that followed revealed shocking details that the royal family had kept carefully hidden from the public. Princess Victoria had, in fact, been secretly corresponding with someone outside the palace. Letters had been smuggled in and out, hidden in laundry baskets and food deliveries. The identity of her correspondent was unknown, but the tone of the letters suggested a relationship of unusual intensity. More disturbing still, servants reported that Victoria had become increasingly withdrawn over the past month. She had stopped eating with the family. She had dismissed most of her ladies-in-waiting, and most tellingly, she had become obsessed with a particular group of book-sold scientific texts, medical journals, and ancient grimoires that dealt with the occult and forbidden knowledge. One book in particular had been found hidden beneath her mattress, its pages filled with handwritten notes in Victoria's careful script. It was a book about paralyzing poisons, about compounds that could be extracted from certain plants, about how to create something that would mimic the effects of complete paralysis without actually damaging the nervous system. As Dr. Hartwell read through these notes, his face grew darker and darker. The bottles on Victoria's vanity had contained something she had made herself, something she had apparently been perfecting for weeks. And the locked door, the missing key, suggested she had done this deliberately. But the question remained, why? Why would a princess, on the verge of her entire adult life, choose to paralyze herself? The answer, when it finally emerged, would prove to be far more complicated and disturbing than anyone could have imagined. The letters arrived 3 days after Victoria's paralysis, delivered to King Edward by a mysterious courier who refused to reveal their identity. There were 12 letters in total, written in a careful, elegant hand-to-hand that was definitely not Victoria's. The author identified himself only as the architect, and his words contained threats, demands, and revelations that would shake the entire kingdom of Heartland to its foundation. Your Majesty, the first letter began, by the time you read this, your daughter will have taken the substance I provided her. She did this of her own free will, as an act of defiance against you and everything your corrupt throne represents. She is now experiencing the early stages of paralysis, a condition that will worsen significantly unless specific antidotes are administered at precise intervals. I alone possess the formula for these antidotes. Without them, Princess Victoria will remain paralyzed forever. King Edward's hands trembled as he read. The letter continued with a list of political demands: the surrender of territory to neighboring kingdoms, the release of political prisoners, the establishment of a new government that would give more power to the common people. It was a manifesto of revolution wrapped in the language of blackmail, but it was the final letter that broke the king entirely. In it, the architect revealed that he had been corresponding with Victoria for over a year, that she had become convinced that her father's reign was corrupt and damaging to the kingdom, that she had willingly agreed to become the symbol of the revolutiona, paralyzed princess, who would demonstrate the cruelty and callousness of the royal family's indifference to common suffering. Daughter, the letter read, understand something you never will, that true change requires sacrifice. She has made hers. Now the question is, will you make yours? The revelation sent shockwaves through the kingdom. Within hours, newspapers across Heartland were printing the story. Not the full story. The king's advisors managed to suppress the most damaging details, but enough. Enough for people to begin questioning the throne. Enough for the mysterious figure called the architect to gain followers. Dr. Hartwell was allowed to visit Victoria on the 5th day. He brought with him a letter from her father, but she refused to acknowledge it. She simply stared at the ceiling, her jaw clenched. Your Highness, Hartwell said gently, I need to understand what you've taken. I need to know the exact composition of the substance in those bottles. Without that information, I cannot help you. I cannot create the antidote. Victoria's eyes moved to look at him. For the first time since the paralysis, she spoke. Her voice was hoarse from disuse, but her words were clear and steady. There is no antidote, she said. He was lying. Hartwell felt the blood drain from his face. What do you mean there's no antidote? I mean, Victoria said slowly, that I drank the bottles myself. All 3 of them. I created the mixture myself from the formulas in the books. There is no architect. There is no one holding the antidote hostage. There is only me and what I've done to myself, and the choice I made to do it. But the letters I wrote them, Victoria interrupted. I wrote them to make it seem like someone else did this to me, to make the public think the kingdom was under threat, to make my father understand that people are suffering and that real change is needed. Hartwell sat down heavily in the chair beside her bed. You've paralyzed yourself, deliberately, as a political protest. Not permanently, Victoria said, and now there was something almost desperate in her voice. The substance will wear off. In 6 months, maybe a year, the paralysis will gradually fade. I researched it thoroughly. I was so careful. It's a temporary condition, doctor. A demonstration. Nothing more? Nothing more? Hartwell's voice rose. Your Highness, do you understand what you've done? You've thrown the kingdom into chaos. There are people rioting in the streets. Your father is in talks with neighboring kingdoms. People are dying because of the civil unrest your actions have sparked. Victoria's eyes filled with tears, but she did not look away. Good, she whispered. Then maybe someone will finally listen. 6 months passed, and the kingdom of Heartland teetered on the edge of revolution. Princess Victoria remained paralyzed. Though she had become more talkative, giving interviews to carefully selected journalists about her motivations and beliefs. She spoke eloquently about poverty, about corruption, about the suffering of common people, while the royal family lived in luxury. The public was divided. Some saw her as a martyr and a hero, while others viewed her as a spoiled brat throwing a tantrum. The media frenzy was constant and overwhelming. Dr. Hartwell monitored her condition obsessively. According to her own research, the paralysis should have begun to fade by now, but it hadn't. If anything, it seemed to be worsening. Victoria's legs had begun to show signs of muscle atrophy. Her skin had taken on a grayish pallor. Something was wrong, and Victoria knew it. The admission came during a private examination. Victoria asked Hartwell to close the door and dismiss all attendants. I made a mistake, she said quietly. What kind of mistake? Hartwell asked, though he feared he already knew. The formula. I based it on historical text accounts from medieval times of poisons used by assassins. But I didn't have access to the original plants. I substituted. I used similar plants that grew in our greenhouses. I thought they would have similar properties. Hartwell felt ice in his stomach. You modified a formula you didn't fully understand? Yes, Victoria admitted. And I think I may have created something different than what I intended. Something that's not fading like it should be. Over the following weeks, Hartwell worked frantically to understand what Victoria had actually ingested. He consulted with chemists, herbalists, and toxicologists, but he had to be careful. If it became public that the princess might have permanently damaged herself, it could spark either a revolution or a violent crackdown. The kingdom was already unstable. The truth he eventually uncovered was both better and worse than anyone feared. The substance Victoria had created was indeed unique, a combination of toxins that had never been documented before. It worked on the nervous system in a way that was only partially reversible. The paralysis might fade, but probably not completely. Victoria would likely spend the rest of her life with some degree of mobility impairment. She had not just made a political statement, she had mutilated herself. When Hartwell presented his findings to King Edward, the king's reaction was one of profound sorrow, mixed with something else, a kind of grim understanding. She knew, the king said quietly. Somehow, some part of her knew what she was doing to herself. Your Majesty, she's always been like this, the king continued, his voice distant, willing to sacrifice everything for what she believes in. When she was a child, she refused to eat for a week to protest our hunting of animals. When she was 12, she tried to give away her entire fortune to the poor. I thought she would grow out of it. I thought it was just youthful idealism. King Edward stared out the window at his kingdom, burning itself apart with civil unrest and debate. But she was serious, he said. She was always serious. The king made a decision that would alter the course of Heartland's history. He announced, in a carefully worded public address, that he would be instituting sweeping reforms. New laws would protect workers and establish fair wages. Land would be redistributed to the poor. The government would become more democratic. With power shared between the monarchy and elected representatives, it was a surrender, a capitulation to the demands of revolutionaries. And it was all because his daughter had poisoned herself to prove a point. 10 years later, Princess Victoria sat in the garden of Ashmore Palace, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. She moved with a cane now, her right leg permanently weakened by the damage the self-administered poison had caused. She walked with a noticeable limp. But she walked. The kingdom of Heartland had transformed dramatically in the decades since her paralysis. The reforms her father had instituted had indeed sparked change, though not always smoothly. There had been economic upheaval, political struggles, and growing pains as the monarchy learned to share power. But there had also been progress. Child labor had been abolished. Schools had been built in poor neighborhoods. Healthcare had been made available to everyone, not just the wealthy. The mystery of the architect had never been officially solved, though everyone who mattered knew the truth. The forged letters had been exposed as Victoria's own work, a detail buried in official reports that the public rarely discussed. History had rewritten itself around Victoria's actions, turning her voluntary self-harm into a noble sacrifice. Rather than a desperate political stunt by a troubled teenager, Victoria had become a complex symbol hated by conservatives, who saw her as a traitor to the throne, and beloved by progressives who saw her as a visionary willing to suffer for her beliefs. She had published books about her experiences, given lectures about social reform, and become an unexpected political figure in her own right, often working alongside the elected representatives that now shared power with her father. But on quiet evenings like this, when she was alone in the gardens, Victoria knew the truth that no one else fully understood. She had hurt herself not for idealism. She had hurt herself because she was desperate, lost, and trying to matter in a world that seemed to move forward without her. The political motivations had come later. A justification constructed in her mind after the act. Dr. Hartwell had never told anyone this. But he had discovered something in Victoria's private journals that he kept locked away. A single entry written the night before she drank the poison. "I don't know who I am. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with this life. Everyone expects me to be perfect, to smile, to wave, to be grateful for my privilege. But I am drowning, and no one can see it. Tomorrow, I will do something so terrible, so undeniable, that I will finally force everyone to acknowledge my existence. And if I destroy myself in the process, at least it will have meant something." The door to the garden opened, and a young man entered. Victoria's husband, who she had married 5 years earlier. He was not royal, but rather the son of a factory worker. Their marriage had been controversial, but it represented everything that the new Heartland stood for: the breaking down of old barriers, the possibility of change. "You'll catch cold sitting out here," he said gently, placing a shawl around her shoulders. Victoria smiled up at him. "I was just thinking about how strange life is. How the worst moments of our lives can somehow become the most important ones." He helped her to her feet, and they walked slowly back toward the palace, her cane clicking softly against the stone path. Behind them, the gardens of Ashmore Palace fell into shadow as night descended. Above, the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Indifferent to the stories of humans below, stories of sacrifice, transformation, and the complicated nature of change, the missing key that had started everything had never been found. It remained lost somewhere in the depths of the palace, a small object that had triggered events that reshaped an entire kingdom. And perhaps that was fitting. The key had never really mattered. What mattered was the girl who had chosen to lock herself away, and the terrible, beautiful price she had been willing to pay.